Retron GX is Hyperkin's newest addition to its long list of modern devices for the retro gaming market. And honestly, I've kind of liked Hyperkin over the years. I haven't bought everything they've released, of course, but what I have gotten I've felt like was, maybe not top tier, but it was right for the price. In particular, the Hyperkin Specialist. I actually think this is one of the better aftermarket turbo controllers out there, certainly in its price range anyway. Now, while the modern retro market has been completely awash with ways to play Sega Genesis and Nintendo games and Game Boy games, that's been somewhat slow to respond to demand for TurboGrafx and PC Engine games. Probably because there's significantly less demand for that. But even still, there's plenty of us out there who would love something like this that doesn't cost an arm and a leg, isn't super complicated to set up, and will just run the games correctly. Enter Hyperkin's Retron GX, which supposedly does exactly that. But does it do what it sets out to do well enough that it's worth the 90-ish bucks that you would have to spend on it? Well, not really. I mean, I hate to say it, but no, not quite. But there's definitely some nuance to that, so let's start from the outside and we'll work our way in. The console itself, I think, looks nice. It's got the ridges and color scheme that works well as a newer iteration of the TurboGrafx. Plus, it matches the Hyperkin Specialist, one of which is included with the console, so that's nice. On the back, you've got pretty much what most clone consoles have these days. An HDMI port that outputs 720p, USB-C for power, and an SD card slot for firmware updates and potentially more fun things down the road. You also have one of those 16:9 to 4:3 switches, which I still don't understand why people want to stretch out their games like that, but some people like it, so whatever. More options are always better than less after all. The front is a little more exciting, with 2 controller ports for actual turbo controllers, and 2 USB ports for different controllers. I'll go over what worked for me in these ports shortly. You also have that telltale switch that displays a reddish orange when it's on to let you know that it's angry, and the little Hyperkin logo lights up as well. Unlike the original turbos though, this switch does not lock the card in place, so hot swapping games is totally doable and supposedly safe, but it does feel awfully weird to do that. Once you turn the console on, you'll be greeted with this screen until you put in an actual game. Once you do that, you'll see this, letting you know that the ROM is being loaded from your Hue card to the system's memory. And if all goes well, you'll be playing a game in just a few seconds. Which is all well and good, but if you want to get into the minutia of the Retron GX, Run and Select will bring up the UI, which I rather like. It has a nice clean look to it, and it lets you get into the more modern features. First, you've got 4 save states, which seems like a somewhat low number in 2025, but you've got them. You also have a quick save and quick load slot that you can use without taking up any of the 4 main saves, which is more convenient for inching your way through tough sections of certain games. These go away after shutting the game off, though. Your visual options are limited to the absolute basics. You've got 1 set of scan lines, a smoothing filter, and a black and white filter, which is kind of interesting, although I can't see myself using it really at all. Unfortunately, there's no intensity sliders or any sort of tweaking that can be done with these. You get what you get, and they're either on or off. You also can't mix and match them, so if you want smoothing and scan lines, well, you can go to hell. Now, I rather like the smoothing filter, and I think a lot of people who might not be used to playing retro games on modern displays might want to consider using it. Conversely, the scan lines, in my opinion, are too intense and darken the image too much. But you might want to use them anyway, and I'll get to why later. As far as aspect ratios go, you've got your 4:3, one that seems to approximate more of a perfect square, and that psychotic 16:9 that stretches out the image makes another appearance here, and I still advise against it. Now, one feature that you don't normally see on these sorts of consoles is the rewind function. You can select a spot in your previous gameplay and go straight to it, which is neat, but it doesn't go back very far. It can be useful if you're trying to get past a specific moment in a boss fight or something, but if you're in one of those situations where you got the wrong weapon or missed an important item a few minutes ago and would like to rewind all the way back to that moment and try something else, you're out of luck. You can only go back here about 12 seconds. Hyperkin calls this 12 frames, but from what I can tell it's more like seconds. Which is good, since 12 actual frames of gameplay would be basically useless. 12 seconds still isn't great though, and if you don't jump right on it after making a mistake, you can easily miss the chance to use it. I've already had multiple instances of that, and I can't help but feel that maybe 30 or 60 seconds would be much more useful. I still appreciate the option though, and I'd like to see more of this on clone consoles. Alright, let's talk controllers. As you would expect, the Hyperkin Specialist, Old School's Turbo Pad, and every original style controller and turbo stick that I plugged into it were detected by the system and seemed to work correctly, as do the 8-bit do-pads and the Hori controller that came with Konami's TurboGrafx Mini in the USB slots. Even the arcade stick from BD Retro Mods works as it should. The controller ports themselves are upside down though, so flip those turbo pad plugs around before applying any force with your OG controllers. Unfortunately, the Turbo Tap does not seem to work, other than being a pass-through for one controller. Now, I have noticed some other reviewers say that you cannot mix and match USB-type controllers with original-type controllers, but in my experience, that claim is entirely false. You absolutely can, and it's not hard to do, you just plug them in. I was able to start a 4-player game of Bomberman 93 and Dungeon Explorer with no issues whatsoever. I'm not sure why different reviewers would be having different experiences, but in any case, 2, 3, and 4-player modes do work, assuming that you've got the 2 different types of controllers that the Retron GX wants you to use, although player 1 will default to the left USB slot when you do that, and as far as I can tell there's no way to switch that around. How about the games though? I own a lot of Turbo and PC Engine Hue cards, so I feel sort of a responsibility to try as many of them as I can, so I did. And while a lot of them did require multiple tries, despite working just fine in other consoles, I was ultimately able to get the vast majority of the games I tested to work. Although I had no luck getting Somer Assault or Jigoku Meguri to work, which are 2 games that I enjoy quite a bit, so that's a little bit of a bummer. EverDrives of any kind are not supported, and in my experience, definitely do not work either. Now, I imagine a jailbreak that lets you load your ROMs onto the SD card probably isn't far away, so that will probably become a non-issue, but until then, you are limited to just playing original Hue cards on this thing. Elephant in the room here perhaps, but no, there is currently 0 way to play CD games on this device, and that may very well be a deal breaker for a lot of people, and I would understand if it is for you, friendly price point or not. With no Super CD compatibility, that means no Shadow of the Beast, no Gate of Thunder, no Valis games, no LDs, and worst of all, absolutely 0 Manhole. But how does it run the games it is designed to play though? Well, unfortunately, this is where the Retron GX gets significantly worse. Right off the bat, as you might have noticed from the footage that I've shown, there is some sort of dithering filter on every game across the board, which makes certain colors that are supposed to be flat into these polka dot patterns. Some people might like this sort of thing, but I really don't, and it's a little shocking that this is here by default with no way to turn it off. Now, I did bring this up to Hyperkin a few days ago, and they assured me that they are working on an update to give us an option to turn this off, so that's good. What's much worse though is that the frame rate and baseline performance of all games on the Retron GX is pretty bad most of the time. To my eye, it looks like the frame rate seems to hover around between 70% of what it should be at best to about 50% at worst. This, in and of itself, completely changes how games look and feel to play, and not in a good way. It also totally breaks a lot of the visual effects that rely on steady performance to look right, like the water here in Legendary X2. This is way off. It's supposed to flash at a consistent rate, as it does here on the Analog Duo, which doesn't have any enhancements or anything like that turned on, it's just running the game correctly. Same thing for the power-ups in Legendary X2. Same thing in Airzong, where the TurboGrafx 16 Mini handles the scrolling text and the spotlight effect here just fine. The Retron GX just can't seem to handle it. Also check out the spinning orbs here and blazing lasers. When the game is being run properly, you can clearly see the orbs spinning smoothly and it looks good. But here the performance is so bad you can barely even tell they're supposed to be spinning. It almost looks more like they're just randomly flashing than circling the ship. On top of all that, the GX struggles to handle just basic scrolling of level backgrounds in every game that I tested. Even games like Splatterhouse that only have one background layer and aren't that demanding seem to push the Retron GX beyond its ability to give us anything approximating the smooth scrolling that you'd get playing this game on the TurboGrafx Mini, the Analog Duo, or original hardware, or for that matter just playing it on your phone or tablet with a $5 emulator. I also noticed a couple instances of strange glitches, like random lines in some games just not scrolling properly. Vigilante has this one through pretty much the whole game. Sinistron has this issue too, but it's more intermittent here. More importantly though, and perhaps the final straw for me, is that the shoddy performance affects how games play. Like in Vigilante, where our hero can only spin the nunchuck in this inconsistent, kind of haphazard way. This is how it's supposed to work. Firing your machine gun in Bloody Wolf is also inconsistent and spotty when the shots should be evenly paced out like they are here on the Duo. The performance also exacerbates input lag and audio lag, both of which are to be expected with software emulation to some extent, but here it's a lot. So if the jittery scrolling, the low frame rates, and strange glitches weren't bad enough, you'll also have to contend with that. To me, these issues are just too big and too numerous to ignore. I could go on with comparisons and nitpicking different things here and there, but I think it's pretty clear what the issue is at this point. The Retron GX, at least in its current state, does not run the games in what I would consider to be an acceptable manner for any price point. The games just aren't represented well here at all, which really sucks. But the less responsive feel that bad performance creates makes games that are already tough, like Aeroblasters that require extreme precision, even harder than they were intended to be, which is not good. On the flip side, it makes slower games that already feel sluggish like Gunboat or Falcon borderline unplayable, although to be completely honest, not a huge loss there. Those games are not good. But that's not the point. The games should be reasonably accurate. It doesn't need to be perfect, especially at $90, but it should be good, and this it isn't. Now, will this improve with firmware updates? Probably, yeah. In fact, I really do expect it to, as I already see glimmers of hope that this thing is capable of much more than what I'm currently seeing out of it. For instance, when I turn the scan lines on, for whatever reason, the performance seems to improve. It still doesn't get quite to where I would like to see it, but it's a huge improvement that could take this console from being something I don't currently recommend at all to one that I could recommend to the right people. So it's a real big shame that the scan lines here are so dark and can't be lightened up a little bit, because the performance improvement I'm seeing here with them turned on comes pretty close to saving the experience on its own. Now, why does adding scan lines improve the performance? I have no idea. That's above my pay grade, but that has been my experience with it thus far. Another smaller thing to note is that the Retron GX seems to be locked to the RGB color palette, which I personally prefer, and I think the colors are close enough and ultimately look fine to me, but if you're one of those folks who prefer the less saturated composite look, you're out of luck on that. Now, thankfully, the audio seems to be handled pretty well across the board. None of the sound effect issues that the Analog Duo had at launch seem to be present here, which is some much-needed good news. Stereo separation sounds about right to my ear, as does the general mixing and balancing of the different channels. So, no issues on that, thank God. So, final thoughts? I guess I'm pretty disappointed overall, and I just can't recommend it. But not just because of the performance issues themselves. I'm disappointed because that bad performance really undermines all the things that they got right, which they did get several things right. I like the UI, I like overall the game compatibility is pretty good. Controller compatibility is pretty good. I like the way the console looks. I like the 2 ports. I like the USB options. I mean, it's not a bad start, but none of that matters if it can't run the games right. Now, I can't say whether or not this console is for you, right? Because only you have your own set of priorities, and that's fair. But let me put it this way. If I were to pre-order this thing and they didn't send me one for review and I spent my own money on it and it ran games the way this currently runs games now, I would be pretty upset. I would be getting a refund almost certainly. The fact that CD games don't run on it, the fact that EverDrives don't work on it, the fact that the rewind function doesn't go back very far. These are all reasonable compromises that you would expect for a software emulation device that costs under $100 in 2025. But again, running the games correctly, or at least close to correctly, that's just not a lot to ask of any device at any price point. It's kind of a bare minimum expectation. Now, once this console is fixed up, which again I do suspect will eventually happen, I think it could very well be worth $90, and I'll be happy to pin a comment on this video letting everybody know that, hey, they fixed it, so, ignore half of this review. But until then, it is what it is. I can only review what I have in my hand. Let me know what you think though. Am I overreacting? Or are you glad that I potentially just saved you $90 in a very disappointing afternoon? Let me know. But until then, thanks for watching.